Hey everybody, the video that follows is going to be a overview of the different historical eras you can use for a D&D campaign. Unfortunately, this one is going to be just about the basics, as this is a very extensive topic. Anything that follows is just going to be a broad overview of anything that you would like to use for a homebrew campaign, where you would like to set a campaign in a different era than the high fantasy campaigns that are normally provided by Wizards of the Coast. So if you want to start a homebrew era where you would like to establish the history of the land that you're starting your campaign in, this would be a good setting. Maybe run it for a few sessions to establish the lore of the area, and just, go from there. So, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome everybody to the introduction to D&D historical campaigns. This is mostly going to be for DMs, as the information in this is going to be based on world building for a homebrew campaign. So we're just going to get right into it and try to avoid all the fluff stuff. So for homebrew historical campaigns, they're going to change the feel of a D&D campaign, mostly for the DMs. It will have a little bit of effect on the players, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So there's going to be a different level of weapons, armor, and classes. Pretty much the classes will stay the same, more or less. You'll just kind of have to tweak them a little bit as you see fit. Some of the abilities or some of the flavor for them might be a little bit more skewed to a modern day D&D campaign. And when I say modern day, I mean more of the high fantasy, more of the middle age feel of a normal campaign setting. Obviously, the weapons and the armor aren't going to be as advanced. You're not really going to have a lot of mithril or a lot of forged armors, especially if you start out in early eras of your world, like you're starting straight from the beginning, right at the intersection of the point when you're actually starting cities, or when the gods' legends are starting to begin. Obviously, you're not going to have forged armor, as forges aren't really common. A lot of stuff is going to be very fluid. Your towns aren't going to be as big. There's not really going to be a whole lot of cities or kingdoms. So a lot of the stuff that the players are going to be getting are more or less makeshift, or they've been worked over, but not to the point that they can be obviously the higher level stuff that you get in a D&D campaign. Obviously these campaigns aren't made to last a whole lot of time. They're not going to be a full level 1 to 20 campaign, just because the stuff that you get maybe around level 10 is probably going to be the same that you get at around level 20. But of course, it's up to you. This is your world. This is going to be something that you're going to change based on the feel of the campaign, based on how you feel that the players are doing, and how far you really want to develop this further. But a main part of this is that harder encounters are going to be normal. A lot of early world monsters, creatures, etc. are going to be much harder for the players. They don't really have a whole lot of information to deal with these creatures, and honestly, just some of the harder monsters will still be more common. You haven't had the time to be able to whittle down the population of harder monsters, such as for example, a basilisk or a T-Rex or any of the other normal monsters that you see very rarely in a D&D campaign. They've had much more time to work on their feeding grounds, their population. They're thriving in this environment. They don't have the challenge of all of the different races kind of banding up together to take down these huge threats against them. But of course, that is only for, obviously, if you're setting it for really, really early in your world's lore. Different eras will have different challenges. Like, obviously, a campaign starting out in the earliest form that you want it to, like the beginning of a continent with, before any towns or any cities have been set up, you'll have much more wild animals, you'll have much more powerful areas where other animals don't go. People just totally avoid because the things there are too hard for them to deal with. But as you move into later eras, more toward the standard D&D era, it might not be monsters that have taken over that area, but it might be a certain tribe that has taken over that area, and they were able to beat this group of monsters because they had a specific way of crafting items or specific way of crafting armor, or they were just smarter than the monsters in that area. But because of that, they're harder to beat than, say, normal bandits, normal groups of tribes, etc., etc. So you do have to take into account how you want to build up areas, how you want to build up encounters, and if you're moving further away from the earlier parts of a world's lore building, you want to take into account different challenges. Just remember that everything will have to be harder than a normal D&D campaign, at least at the beginning, because it's so primal, it's different, it's not as established. And the way that it should feel to players as in opposition to a normal D&D campaign, it will be easier to build a world for them. They'll have much more impact as they're probably one of the first few groups of adventurers. They might even be the first few groups that actually succeed. It gives them more of a chance to help them shape the world that they will hopefully be playing in further down the line, or at least give them a chance to shape the world that they're currently playing in. As obviously, as a normal D&D, they're going to be much more powerful than everyone else. Not even just at the beginning, but certainly later down the line. So it gives them a little bit more chance to kind of establish things in the lore for the world that they might be playing in later. Also, there will be less equipment to manage, just because magical items will be much, much more rare, and they'll probably be only dealing with common-ish items. This is to say, not super magical. The magical items they get will probably be from a deity or someone who is exceptionally powerful that they've done a great deed for, that they're able to give to them as a reward. But on the flip side of that, encounters and problem solving will be harder, as they won't have the magic items that they're so used to solve problems. Like if they have to go down a cliff, they're not going to have immovable rods to anchor ropes or use them in whatever way they manage to figure out, as players are normally pretty creative. So there's going to be a lot of issues with trying to solve things. But again, that definitely is up to you, as you can kind of, as most of this is homebrew and you'll be managing it as you see fit. You'll see what works, what doesn't. Obviously, none of this is play tested. This is just an idea. But one of the main things that will be much harder to homebrew is survival. Obviously, it's going to be a lot harder. Some things are going to be so much different that it may be hard for your players to understand the stakes versus normal, quote-unquote, normal campaign. But please make sure that your players are comfortable with this, or if they're not comfortable with making it too much harder, make it a little bit simpler, and just try to make it as good for them as possible, but definitely try and get them into the world building. But we'll definitely touch on why this will make it a little bit harder in the next section. So there's the basics of the issue with trying to build a homebrew campaign in earlier eras and how it can kind of affect the players. So there's going to be a lack of established towns or kingdoms, depending on how you want to run this. Towns and kingdoms are obviously going to be harder to establish, as farming and animal husbandry are not as advanced. You don't really have that time that you're able to develop sophisticated levels of farming where you're able to maintain large farms that can feed not only just a household, but areas around it. You can't figure out how to make this farm so productive that you can sell off your excess goods. In animal husbandry, you might just not have animals that are around that are able to be tamed, and even if they are able to be tamed, you might not know how to tame them. Obviously, this stuff changes as you go through different eras, so you would want to kind of tweak them a little bit. Like, farming may be good enough to kind of help out the town that they're in, but mostly it would be a farming town, and the excess would go towards the families whose farms got flooded or got rampaged by a group of monsters or animals or etc. And the animals that you gather might not be like cows. They might be goats or sheep or smaller animals that won't be as hard to manage or don't take as much resources to manage. And on top of that, the technology might not be advanced enough to make this worth it. It's harder to maintain a town and maintain the infrastructure around it than it is to subscribe or go toward a hunter-gathering lifestyle, as it's easier to just move with the herds of animals that you're following and maybe take one or two off of the herd to feed your very small group of individuals that you've decided to take with you, or grab or forage for goods in the woods that you need, or just grab water from a stream that you might follow. And since water's needed for pretty much every living thing, the herds will obviously follow the river. The monsters will follow the river that you can use to get the resources worth it. Make it worth it to keep this lifestyle. And on top of that, everyone, if you want to establish a town, not everyone will be able to work on farming or animal husbandry. There will have to be guards that make sure that no one shady is getting in, there's no bandits coming, and people to build up the town. Make sure that you have defenses, whether it be just walls of wood, walls of stone, maybe dig ditches around the town so that it makes it harder for people to give in. It's just much harder to establish a stationary area in earlier eras than making a tribe that moves around from place to place as a DM, just because all the logistical stuff about it, it's much, much, much harder. And another thing to consider as the DM or GM is that if you do establish a town, you would want to keep it small so that there's less people that you have to account for in the logistics or anything else. So it is harder to convince migratory tribes to move in due to the issues that I've previously described. So if you do end up building a town in an area, it might just want to be a collection of tents where people have found that this is a pretty good area to live in most of the season or all of the seasons, because it might be in a temperate climate or whatever. But it's harder to convince people to move in because they already see that there's people here and the land is already at the breaking point, more or less, where they can't really sustain more than they already have. And on top of that, outside of all the issues with having a party come into town, obviously a party is going to need food. Most of the times in D&D you buy rations. You don't have to worry about it. It just costs a couple gold to get enough to last through a week, a month, or maybe you don't have to deal with it as the DM style that you're running. But in this situation, I would recommend having food as an essential issue that you would have to deal with, just because it makes it a little bit easier to get into the world, realize how the world building is being made, how towns have to deal with it, how the cities have to deal with it. And moving forward, it might bring your players a little bit further into the world, hopefully. Obviously, every player will be different, every DM will be different. Hopefully you can kind of suss it out between hopefully a discussion with your players before the game, or after a few sessions you deal with it then. But on the subject of food, obviously processed foods or rations are going to be harder to find. The technology just doesn't exist where they're able to preserve food for a long amount of time, so they're not able to make the things that a party would need to last months or weeks out on the road. And even if they do make it, it will be much, much harder for them to make because they're used to this migratory lifestyle. They're just trying to figure out how to live in a town, how to live in a city. And it will be much harder to convince it to sell to a party that's just coming in for a few days and then leaving. They don't want to give up those valuable resources that they spent so long to make that will help them out in the long run. So to deal with this, what you really want to emphasize is foraging and survival for a party will make up most, if not completely replace their rations. So when they're having a long rest on the road, maybe during their rest hours or the first couple of hours in a long rest during their watch, they'll take a little bit of time to forage around the area, see what they can get. Obviously, this will have to be workshopped according to each party. It might just have to be someone that does it at the beginning, or maybe the whole party is able to do it. But I think it will be an interesting dynamic, as they're not just going to have food available. They kind of have to find the food that they need as they're adventuring along. And obviously, tribes, towns will be harder to convince to sell long-lasting rations they have, whether that be just these certain berries they found, or they were able to make a certain type of meat last longer due to the resources in the area. They might be able to spare them if the party helps them, or, God forbid, their party just takes them from the people. I'm not saying that rations aren't going to be able to be used by the party, but they will definitely be a much rarer resource than they normally are. I would put them on the level of, I would say rare items, maybe a little bit higher than that, but just, they won't necessarily be able to find them as easily, but people will be able to give them up if the party provides them a good enough reason to. They're able to complete a few quests, they're able to help them out, or find a new area to move into that enables them to have more food where the rations won't be as much of a needed commodity. Now, obviously, since it is a bit of the earlier eras, money and rewards will be much, much different than they normally are in a D&D campaign. And set in the standard era of D&D, high fantasy, whatever have you. So obviously money as like a centralized currency will not be available. They don't have mining operations set up to make gold for the money. They can't find silver, whatever, what have you. Obviously you can homebrew this. Maybe one tribe has gold that they help out and they gives them a bunch of gold, which they can use further down the line. Not as coins, but just like as a pure weight system that they can use. So instead of currency or coins or whatever they can use as money, the barter system will be much more prevalent. Having extra items on them, maybe they just completed a quest and they were able to find a better weapon on a monster, or they were able to find better armor from harvesting the monster. Keeping that armor until they can get to a town to trade that now outdated item for what they need might help them in the long run. That might help them get the rations that I mentioned earlier, as nobody has this type of armor. So giving it to the strongest person in the tribe or strongest person in the town, or being able to use it as a blueprint to replicate it further down the line, might be more valuable than having the food, as it helps them get more food or helps them survive a little bit longer. So as a DM, you just want to make sure of that. You kind of want to have a little bit of real world realism when you're starting this kind of campaign, as money isn't going to be prevalent. You have to think about the progression of the technology in the area. If you do give the party something more advanced, think about how it will impact areas around them. If they find something better and they're able to sell it, or if they just bring it to someone, they might give them rations or gold or whatever your reward system is to study it and use it for a little bit and figure out how to make that for themselves. But when you're running quests, obviously you want to give something to the party to make it worth their time, and not just from the quest giver. Maybe they find something in the area. Obviously items will be used more than currency. Maybe you can throw some food in there if they're raiding a bandit camp, or if they fight some monsters or other creatures. You can use that time to harvest some food off of them. But obviously items are not going to necessarily be the main focus of these campaigns. It's going to be more of a world building thing, as more of a reward down the line for the players, because it will be so hard to get anything that they will be able to use in future campaigns, unless it is something bestowed upon them by a god or an aspiring god or someone extremely powerful. Obviously, there will be specialized weapons and armor, but they will be much harder to find, as you're not going to find a +1 mace just in a dungeon somewhere, as dungeons probably won't exist. It might be a cave that got taken over by a relatively powerful wizard or barbarian or whatever you want to use in that area, but it won't be the chiseled out stone stronghold that you would expect later on. It would just be an area that they found that they were able to use. More likely, you'll get the specialized weapons and armor sold to you, or more likely traded to you from tribes that are moving around, or the towns that manage to set up a forge. So a certain town you might have set up a forge, so they'll be able to build probably not plate armor, but metal armor that is incorporated into a leather armor. So it might armor class than a normal armor that you would get from anybody else. Obviously, homebrewing is up to you, so you can decide how to use that, how not to use that. But specialized weapons. Maybe one tribe figured out how to make crossbows, or one tribe figured out how to make bows better, or spears last longer. I think a good way to manage this would be have a few tribes or towns in the area that figured out how to make something better than everybody else, to incentivize exploring, incentivize activity between different groups in the area, maybe try to help them out a little bit more, establish things in your lore. And obviously there is the potential for finding someone who's exceptionally powerful in the world that you might want to establish as a deity further down in your campaign. They might be able to help them, and they might give them the first of a magic item, which either they can keep to themselves or donate to the tribe. Not necessarily donate, but let a tribe or town / city or whatever you want to use look at, maybe figure out how to use it, and just kind of start the pathway forward for future campaigns and other magic items that you want to establish. If you have a really cool idea for a homebrew item that you haven't been able to use yet, this would be the perfect place to set it off. Maybe a god figured out how to use it and gave it to one of the party members so that they're able to use it, or have a specialized tribe make that item through trial and error or whatever. So again, homebrewing is the king of the castle, so to say, in this kind of setting, as there's not really a whole lot of precedence for this. You'll obviously be starting much earlier than most of the system is prepared for. You won't really have a whole lot of items that are normal. This will obviously take a lot of work on your part as a DM. And it will also take a little bit more effort from the players, so please make sure that your players are okay with this kind of system before starting out. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the previous content. Obviously, we'll have so much more coming in the future, as there's a lot of information on this that I would like to share with all of you. If you have any questions or further interest, please comment below. Thank you so much, and hope you enjoy the rest of our content.